In 1867, Martin Oates was arrested and taken into custody in San Francisco. What was his offense? He was ugly. As a Union soldier, he had been stricken by paralysis, leaving him, quote, a perfect wreck. Martin Oates was the first person to be subject to a new unsightly beggar ordinance in San Francisco. This is also named an ugly law. Hi there, I am Carol Westerberg. I work with Stanford Web Services. I do front-end development and assist with accessibility issues. And I recently received my certified professional in accessibility core competencies. In this presentation, I want to examine the history of society's views on disabilities. So in this slide, you see a picture of a book. It's called The Ugly Laws, and it was written by Susan M. Schweik in 2009. There's a quote on the front that says, "Any person who is an unsightly or disgusting object shall not therein expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine of $1. This type of law started in San Francisco and it was soon adopted by other cities such as Chicago, Denver, Portland, and outside the United States in Manila, Philippines. These ugly laws criminalized disabilities, denied people with disabilities of their human rights, basically treated them as objects. In this slide, you see the picture of the Christian Bible in a paraphrased quote from Leviticus 21:16 to 23. And it's paraphrased, and it says, "A man blind or lame who has a marred face or any limb too long, a man who has a broken foot or a broken hand, or is a hunchback or a dwarf, or a man who has a defect in his eye or eczema or a scab, or is a eunuch, he shall not approach the altar because he has a defect, lest he profane my sanctuaries." Laws against disabled people didn't start in 1867 with San Francisco. They have been part of our culture for a very long time. This text in Leviticus dates back to about 300 BCE. So the Bible portrays a disability as a curse and a punishment. In fact, people with disabilities have a higher rate of poverty and are less healthy than the general population. It's been noted the effects of disabilities are lower rates of education, lower rates of employment, greater rates of health issues such as smoking, diabetes, and obesity, and greater rates of poverty. So in the 1800s, society's answer at this time was to put disabled people in institutions. In this picture on the slide, you see a line of beds with children lying in them. It's from the Crip institution. Now, according to the National Park Service, these facilities were often overcrowded and dirty, or unregulated. Men and women lived in the same space with little oversight. Living in such an institution was involuntary. And it's when families couldn't cope with their insane or physically disabled family members, these individuals became wards of the state. As late as 1967, researcher Froelich found that there's about 500,000 severely disabled people who are long-term residents of these kinds of institutions. So people with disabilities have often been thought of as objects needing charity, medical treatment, and social protection. We can see this no more clearly as with the Jerry Lewis Telethon for Muscular Dystrophy. This fundraiser used to air every Labor Day, and it raised millions of dollars for disabled people. However, these same disabled people protested the telethon. Why was that? The telethon portrayed people as objects for charity. On this slide, you see a quote from a frustrated Jerry Lewis saying, "Pity? You don't want to be pitied because you're a cripple in a wheelchair? Stay in your house." And there's a picture with a man sitting in a wheelchair and a sign that reads, "Don't believe the lies of the telephone." James Cherry was a law student, and he wrote with a law student with a disability. And he wrote, in 1970, we had no right to education, to employment, to transportation, to housing, or to voting. There were no civil rights laws for us, no federal advocacy grants, and few people looked beyond our medical needs. So before 1970, having a disability was viewed as having a medical problem and a charity case. Around 1970, a shift in thinking began to take place. Rather than thinking of disabilities as a medical or charity problem, people began to thinking of disabilities as a social problem. That is, society needs to remove the barriers that keep people with disabilities from participating in society. So in the slide, you see a picture of people sitting in wheelchairs in front of a bus, and they are protesting the lack of transportation for disabled people. So in around 1973, the Rehabilitation Act made it illegal for federal agencies or institutions that receive federal funding to discriminate against anyone solely on the basis of a disability. It addressed areas of transportation, education, and hiring. This step was one of the steps that removed some of the barriers, but there are more. So in 1990, the Americans for Disabilities Act was up for a vote in Congress. And it was struggling to get approval. And so on March 13th, 1990, over 1,000 people marched from the White House to the U.S. Capitol and demanded that Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. You can see in this picture, when they got to the U.S. Capitol, about 60 of them climbed out of their wheelchairs and crawled up the Capitol steps. This Capitol crawl was a physical demonstration of how inaccessible architecture impacts people with disabilities. The Capitol crawl highlighted the urgency behind the need to pass the ADA. And you can see in this picture that on July 26, 1990, George H.W. Bush signed it into law. Now, where the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 addressed federal funding, the ADA addresses public funding or public organizations. Moving on to the UN, in 2006, the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities demonstrated a change in attitudes and approaches with disabilities. It signals on a worldwide scale that persons with disabilities should not be considered objects, but instead subjects with rights who are capable of making decisions for their lives based on their free and informed consent, as well as being members of society. In this picture from the UN, you can see a person in the wheelchair participating in an assembly. Throughout history, people with disabilities have struggled with having the same rights and freedoms as non-disabled people. We've seen the progression. Society views these people going from objects to subjects. Far from the ugly laws of the 1890s and 1900s, this picture shows a blending of both disabled and non-disabled people. The struggle for the rights of people with disabilities mirrors other struggles for civil rights. We see, at this time, I'd like to recognize and honor the struggles of both the women, the Black, the brown, and the LGBTQ. I also recognize and honor the struggles of the disabled. We have seen there is a long history of people with disabilities being regulated to the back door, both in the literal sense and the metaphorical sense. Restaurants with stairs leading up the front door are not wheelchair accessible. So they post signs telling wheelchair users they need to go through the back door. Not being able to use the front door is inconvenient and stigmatizing. And I'm sure wheelchair users would much rather use the front door like everybody else. So as we build our buildings, our applications, and our websites, let's keep in mind that changes and adjustments that we make to remove these barriers will make things accessible for all people. These changes allow someone with disabilities to participate on an equal footing with someone else, and and the big change from where we were in 1867. Thank you for your time.